Hugh is a scholar of philosophy and politics, graduating from the University of Warwick in 1983. But since 2007, he has been with the London-based Nuffield Council on Bioethics and director of that center. He spent years prior to that working on the, for the European Commission in Brussels, and responsible for funding and promotion of multidisciplinary research in bioethics, biomedicine, and health research programs. The Nuffield Council is independent of the government there. Nuffield Council on Bioethics. It is among a number of organizations and committees that are complementary to the British government and advise, or at least provide, information on ethical issues. I guess in about 20 years of existence, you've addressed about 40 topics. And neighborhood 20 reports coming out of those, and they go from A to Z, from agriculture to xenotransplantation, or at least A to X. And Y and Z need to be addressed yet. But in their most recent report published last month, it focuses on the issues raised by online medicine and medical profiling, such as commercial genetic testing and body imaging. And he will be discussing that report with us, although he tells me he's been scratching furiously based on some of the comments today. So I think we simply want to hear broadly from you and welcome you to the deliberations of this commission.
I switched the microphone on to enhance the applause.
That's it.
Thank you very much indeed. I will say just a few things first, if I may, before I start. The first is the thanks. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to come here, for the privilege that it is, the pleasure it's been, the welcome that you've given me already, and the opportunity I think that it presents for us to start. And I know I speak on behalf of my council now, to start a conversation now. That this isn't an event as far as we're concerned, but really I think the beginning of what hopefully will be a fruitful conversation with you. I would also just like to say how impressed I've been just over the last day and a half with how far you have travelled in a short space of time with your work on synthetic biology, which we know is one of the trickiest problems of the day. To have travelled so far, to have put it together with the approach that you have, and to have articulated it and presented it the way that you have over the past day and a half, I've been very impressed. So I congratulate you already on what you've done. I'm looking forward to the final report. I would also like to say that the difficulty with being last up in a meeting like this is that I've had the chance to listen to a lot of things, very interesting things. I've seen a lot of connections with the work that we do, that we have done, and that we will do. And I then, all of the things that I intended to say are kind of affected by that. So I am kind of scrambling to fit in some additional observations. So what I will do, if you will permit me, is to give a brief introduction to the Nuffield Council, to give a brief overview of our report on medical profiling and online medicine. You should have available to you short copies of the report and access to the full report, but we'll just touch briefly on it for now. And then an outline of our future plans, because I think that could be very interesting in terms of some of the things that you will be thinking of, but also ways that we might continue to talk into the future. So there's loads of things that I would like to say, loads of reasons why I'd like to turn this into a conversation. So if I speak very quickly, that's deliberate. So do I need to be... we okay? We're right. The council was established in 1991. That's almost 20 years now. It was a cluster of people, scientists, medics, philosophers, lawyers, together, who actually identified the need for a critical evaluation of developments in science and medicine. And they actually took the idea to government at the time, who felt that they did not wish to establish a national commission for the study of bioethics, but encouraged them to go to other agencies to see if there was any external means of developing this. And so it was that in 1991 the Nuffield Foundation initially supported the Council, and they were joined shortly afterwards by the Medical Research Council and the Wellcome Trust. So we do operate independently. We are funded by these three agencies. They don't exert any influence over the Council in terms of what it chooses to study or what it chooses to say. So we do operate entirely independently, which is a phenomenal strength, together with sustained quality. I think these are the two planks on which it's built. The question of whether there might be a national commission on bioethics has been revisited on a couple of occasions, most recently just 2 years ago in 2008 during the passage of some related legislation. And the government minister, Baroness Royal, in the House of Lords, name-checked the Council, amongst one or two other bodies, stating that the current, in the UK, what she called a distributed system of bioethical advice, that it works well. It remains our view that a national human bioethics commission would not bring sufficient benefits in comparison. So we have a place in the system that is recognised, but it's not a national commission. It's not got any constitutional or statutory basis. And here I've set down what that system consists of. Government does have advisory bodies, the Human Genetics Commission and others. There are a couple of statutory authorities that also provide advice in bioethical areas, and independent bodies ourselves amongst one or two others. I don't know how familiar you are with the term bonfire of the Quangos. It's a term that's very prominent in the UK at the moment, Quangos being semi-autonomous advisory government bodies, and they are about to be, the bonfire is to say that many of them are about to be disbanded. This includes the Human Genetics Commission, the Gene Therapy Advisory Commission, both of the statutory bodies working in the area of human fertilisation and human tissue. And so there's kind of an interesting time ahead of us where one could say that there's a space opening up into which we might move, although we need to take care that it doesn't draw us, if you like, closer to advising government in a direct sense. But nevertheless, it's an interesting time, and I think that the task that lies ahead of us is probably greater even than it might have been otherwise. The terms of reference that we work with, and I'll just pause very briefly on this because I think it is worth noting this. There are three distinct parts to this. One is that we are asked to identify and define issues that are of concern raised by biological sciences. The second is to promote public understanding and discussion. We struggle with how to achieve this, and you will do the same. We talk to other bodies that do the same, but this is nevertheless an important part of what we do is to use our work to promote public discussion of these issues. And the third is to publish reports and make recommendations. And we take this to mean that it is important that our work is policy focused. We are looking for outcomes. We are looking to deliver policy recommendations that have meaning and that can be implemented. This is not academic work. It is not work to be left on a shelf. And we follow through on that. So I just think important noting that and having that in mind as we work through this. The Council itself consists of members who range from basic and applied scientists, clinicians, philosophers, anthropologists, sociologists, lawyers, ethicists. We have a great range. And as you will see from this, the Council is greater in number than your Commission, but probably a good deal more unattractive. The Secretariat, on the other hand, I show you this for an important reason. The Council has that much expertise amongst it. The Secretariat carries out a hugely important function. I would say that, wouldn't I? But we have amongst our Secretariat staff people who have sound experience in policy, which is my area, medicine, science, law, ethics, but also communications as well. And so I think it's important to note that the strength of the Secretariat is something that the Council recognises as an important part of its work as well. The way that we work, and this is where we really, I think there is a point of distinction here between what we do and the way that you are working up to now, is that I should preface this by saying that topic selection, the way we select our topics, is actually quite an extended process. We work up from a long list to a short list. We thrash it out in a seminar with invited experts. We then will run a potential topic through a workshop, again with a group of experts. And then, once we've clearly defined a topic, and that's an important part of preparing the ground, if you like, for an effective piece of work, we establish a working party. This is where we draw in experts from relevant fields to work on this with us, supported by members of the Secretariat. But we tie them into the Council as well. So usually 2 members of the Council will be members of the working party, and the chair of the working party will, for the duration of that, usually about 2 years, become an ex officio member of Council. So there's an interaction between the Council and its working parties. The process is critical. This is, again, something that you will have talked about, and I think, again, we could fruitfully talk about some of these things. The process of fact-finding, of having meetings with relevant parties, with expert academics, with industry, with NGOs, with patient and consumer groups. So these will be face-to-face meetings, as well as a public consultation in which people are invited to submit their views and opinions around the topic. This is promoted through as wider media promotion as we can. The draft report, the kind of stage that you're at the moment, is the stage at which we would put this out to a peer review. So we will identify probably 10 or 12 experts across a range of disciplines in connection with any particular report, and we will ask them, have we missed anything? Are we way off beam? Is this coherent? Is it comprehensive? Is it realistic, and is it implementable? So we will challenge ourselves, if you like, by inviting people to critically review the report at that point, and then on publication we promote it publicly, but also with the policy makers, and we will follow that through to try and have meetings with them face to face, and to try and promote that.
Excuse me, you wrote down a list of 4 or 5 things that you said about the report that you're asking the peer reviewers.
We will ask them whether there are any holes in it, whether it's complete in terms of the territory that it's trying to cover, whether we have missed any particular arguments, so whether there are aspects of the issue that we have failed to address properly, whether our report is coherent, that is to say, that it works its way through and arrives at its conclusions in a sufficiently logical and persuasive manner, and that we haven't, that we're just not way off beam. We're trying to make sure that we're on the right track. We've got an argument that is sound. We don't ask them to agree with us, but at least to identify, if they don't agree, that we've addressed those kind of arguments. Much in the way that you were talking about a little earlier, if there are issues of principle, let's take them head on rather than take them out of the picture. We've got notes about this that we kind of briefing notes that we give to peer reviewers. That's okay. There's another important part of this, and this is the way we work, and if we've had some success, we're sticking to our model because it seems to be doing the job. But there's an important relationship between the Council and its working parties. The Council is invited to adopt each report when it's completed, and has done so in every case so far. But it doesn't do so simply at the end of the process. At each stage, the work in progress, the draft report comes to the Council, the proposed ethical framework comes to the Council, and the Council critically examines that, has a subgroup of Council members who specifically take that task on. And what my chairman describes as a dialectical struggle takes place, whereby there's a kind of iteration of arguments between the Council and its working party. And this is really about challenging people if claims are made, about making sure that arguments are transparent, that they are properly argued, and that they've been properly challenged. And so that's, again, an important feature, I think, of how our work progresses. Now, the elements of this starts to kind of break up a little bit now, and I'll go through this a bit quickly, but we can stop and talk about any particular things. It's important to see some of this. We work in the UK, I quite like this word, it's adhocracy. Things come together simply by chance in certain moments, and we're a part of that. We're also part of an environment in which the separation of government from the administration is something that we're all familiar with. So to be able to operate as we do, independently, within this kind of dissipated set of bodies and advisory structures, is a comfortable place for us to be. We operate independently, set our own agenda, we choose our own topics, we look for topics that are timely, that are policy relevant. And so this is, again, an important part of our environment. The members of council and working parties are chosen because of their individual qualities, their skills, their experience. They are not there to represent their profession, or to represent a point of view, or to represent some deontological position. They are aware of this, and it means that the council is not itself bounded by particular principles. It doesn't declare itself of a particular philosophical standing on it, ab initio, as it were. But it rather applies itself to each particular question in the way that particular question demands. So the influence that it has is based not because of its constitutional position or because it has a particular authority, but because of its independence and because of the quality of its work. We do work to see that recommendations are taken up, but at the same time, we recognise that we're part of a process. We're not giving the definitive last word on anything. We have a unique history. I don't think that if you tried to set this up now, you could replicate it. I don't think you would necessarily do the same thing today as happened then. I don't think that you could transplant it necessarily into another environment. We can't simply say that if France needs a bioethics commission, we have something ready-made. I don't think it can work quite like that. We occupy this space of practical public reasoning, I think, and I think your discussion about the democratic reasoning as well touches very closely on this. And my chairman, he's got a way of kind of coming up with these phrases. He describes what we do as internally as civilized contestation, and I think this is. But the common purpose is also important, that we gather people who are prepared to be engaged in that kind of process, are prepared to put their arguments on the table, to have them challenged, and to do so in a way that they expect to be fruitful. It can exclude people who are at extreme positions to some extent, but again, one has to recognise the arguments, be prepared to listen to them, and our process ensures that there is the opportunity for those positions to be made known. But they have to be addressed even if they are ultimately not satisfied. There are phrases that are often used around the kind of thing that we do about striking a balance and bridge building, whether it's between academia and policy or between different positions. We tend to use these words a lot. I'm a bit sceptical about them because I think that it suggests, and as you talked about, not setting up us and them situations, this underestimates the complexity of the positions that people hold. And so bridges aren't just between two places. A balance isn't simply between two things. So we're working in a much more complex environment that increasingly is global. The implications of the work that you're doing obviously reaches very far, as do many of the reports that we've worked on and expect to work on. It's complex, it's dynamic, and we can't expect to give a definitive position, but we can hope to contribute significantly. That was very rapid. I enjoy talking about the council, I have to say, and there are an enormous number of things that you could kind of tease out from amongst that, and maybe we'll have the chance to do that. But I would just like to spend a little time then on our most recent report, published just a couple of months ago, Medical Profiling and Online Medicine. We struggled with actually defining this topic a lot of people, what is it about? Why did we do this? And really, I think the way I find it easiest to describe is that we arrived at a time when two things came together, broadly speaking. One was a cluster of technologies, largely based around digital technologies and internet-based technologies that were making claims about offering to people a more personalised approach to their healthcare, an approach that would give them more predictive abilities, better preventative options. And this was a set of claims and technologies that needed some scrutiny to test those kind of claims. At the same time, there was a kind of more social and cultural environment developing and political environment developing, which was about choice, which was a political question of providing choice, of raising questions about the extent to which people should take personal responsibility for their health, and of an increasing consumerisation in healthcare. Now, this is set against the UK backdrop, where we have, of course, a universal public healthcare system, which I think makes this whole question different in its context to the way that it might play out in the States. But for us, it did raise questions when these two broad areas of technological advance and claims and the societal changes about choice, responsibilisation, consumerisation were coming together. What was this going to mean for our health systems? What would it mean for our doctor and patient relationships? What was the future of this question of individual responsibility or risk pooling that the health service represents? So this was the broad environment that we were trying to examine. We went through, so the report talks about this social context. It proposes an ethical framework, looks at the kind of interventions that we might contemplate, and then has these half a dozen case studies around what actually is a thread of how an individual now could actually manage their own healthcare without seeing a doctor at all. I'm, a guy reaching a certain age. I've got the usual aches, pains, and creaks that I might have. I'll look stuff up online. I'll diagnose myself. I could order drugs online without seeing a doctor. I can prescribe to myself. I can then go down and get my genome profiled. I can get my body scanned, and I can go around the whole circle again and still get no medical advice. So this was the thread, in a sense, of what we were looking at. If we look at all of those types of technology, those types of circumstance, we identified then the ethical values that commonly arose in the context of this, and these are the protection of private information, individuals' right to pursue their own interests in their own way, the state's responsibility to reduce harm, the efficient and fair use of public resources, and the belief that public policy should be informed by the principle of social solidarity, and that is the main principle underpinning the public healthcare system, obviously in the UK and in large parts of Europe, and certainly.
Something about what you mean, not just you individually, but what comes means by social solidarity, as well as a common term for you. I think the term isn't commonly used here. We understand what it means definitionally, but what does it really mean?
Well, I think there are probably a number of different dimensions to it. One is, in this context, about the pooling of risk, is that we recognise that we all have differential risks. We can't necessarily identify them at the outset, and so there's a kind of social agreement that what we will do is we will share the risk to the equally, as it were, and be willing to pick up the bill for others if that turns out to be greater. It also engages the question of protecting those who are vulnerable, so that as a society we recognise our responsibility to other people, in a previous report, people who one might describe as fellow travellers. So we recognise the affinity that we have with fellow travellers. Okay. And there is another dimension to this, and we're starting to talk about this concept in several of our reports. So this is not just here. We talked about it in our report on dementia. It will also arise in our forthcoming report on biofuels, interestingly. But the other aspect to it is about what you might call the common good. That is to say that it represents a good that is shared that can be more than the sum of its individual parts. Whilst there are individual goods that one can put together, there is something more than that, which is a common good that we share. So solidarity, I think, represents a complex set of ideas that are brought together there. Indeed, I think that's right. And one of the I said earlier that the council doesn't kind of declare itself to be attached to particular principles that it then applies to every different situation. But in each particular topic it approaches, it identifies those ethical values that are at stake, and then constructs them into the kind of framework that you've done here, which I think is works extremely well. But it's important that those values are things that people can understand, that people can sign up to. The definitions that we use tend to be quite fluid, and I think one has to be careful about what one uses, but also ready to explain it. So our reports will explain the thinking that's gone into it and the meaning that we're attaching to it in this particular context as well. That's partly why our reports are so long, if you pick up the big version, but we boil them down for easy consumption. What often, of course, happens is that values can be in conflict. Now, I thought it was interesting, I think, that you said yesterday that you felt that the 5 principles in your ethical framework were really quite consistent with each other. I think that there are, well, I don't want to doubt you, but it would be interesting to examine whether that is truly the case, because I think that often these do come into conflict with one another, and one has to find a mechanism for resolving that conflict.
Just to be clear, I think it's true that the 5 are not in inherent conflict with one another, but within each of them, there are conflicts such as balancing benefits and risks under public beneficence. And each one, you would find conflicts internal to them.
Yes, and then when you look at any particular situation, you may find that, for example, if I have a right to pursue my own interests in my own way, and that means taking gathering certain information about my health status, but that then leads me into making demands of the health service, there's a conflict then between my private interest being pursued and the burden that it might place on the public health system. So this is the kind of conflict that one then has to resolve. And what we say here is that we don't think that there is one single value that trumps the others, that is always the primary value, but that what we try to do is to identify where those conflicts arise, and rather than decide one way or the other, rather to soften the dilemma, which is the way that we've put it in the context of this report, because we're not looking for hard-edged regulatory measures, but ways of diminishing the kind of conflicts that arise if there are tensions between these values. So we would expect to see intervention only if it is feasible, it's effective, and that will have to be based on good evidence. If the harm is serious, and the intervention should be the minimum necessary to achieve its effect and should be generalised rather than specific where possible. So, for example, on the question of information that is given by the genome analysis companies or by body scanning companies, we would want the industry to find its own standards rather than immediately regulate with central directives. So you come in at the level. If we look at the way that they advertise, the claims that they make, we would expect the general advertising standards regulations to apply rather than create very specific novel standards for this particular situation. So that's the general approach that we've taken on this. Very briefly, what we see here with this cluster of technologies are ways that can potentially offer benefits in terms of the way that people approach their healthcare and get as consumer goods and get more choices and more benefit from them. But to make use of those, people need to be guided towards where to get good information, how to make use of that information, and sometimes this is going to involve an intervention, for example, with government websites, with help to direct people to websites that are maybe kite-marked or accredited, with support maybe from the general practitioners who maybe need to be trained in how to deal with genome-wide analyses where people are looking at information or scans that are complex and, as was pointed out earlier, may vary in terms of their specificity and applicability in different types of circumstance. So if people are going to make use of this, we need to create an environment in which they can arrive confidently at good information and know how to use that information. So that's the broad approach that's been taken. So we make various recommendations. I won't stop on this because we can look them up or we can talk about them later, but I'd like to just... so for health information, government should provide information or direct people to sites that are well-grounded and are kept up to date. Online drug purchasing... there is a system in the UK of accreditation of online pharmacies. That's a system that would be good if we could apply it worldwide because people are getting their stuff from outside the UK. Genetic profiling and body imaging, we know well that these are not well founded in terms of their research base. They are making claims that are dubious. So people need to be very, very careful and to be helped to manage this information, although at the moment we have not seen sufficient harms coming from these to warrant more serious intervention or banning them, other than whole body CT scanning, actually. So, technologies are still developing. There are potential benefits and harms, but we need to keep an eye on it if they are to deliver goods, and people do need support in helping them, in approaching them. So if I may just take another 5 minutes, I'm not quite sure what our timing is supposed to be here. I really do want to just have a brief word about the future issues, the kind of things that we're looking at. We look for topics that are novel, they're timely, they're complex, and where we can make a unique contribution. There are some topics in the UK where everybody's been around them enough times that it's difficult to see that we're going to add anything else. So we tend to look at things that are quite intractable, but where we can do something new. We're working on a report on new approaches to biofuels. That's due to be published early next year. And on the human body, the donation of bits of the body or the whole of the body for therapeutic or research purposes, and the kind of the potential for commercialization in that area. This is a report that's creating a lot of excitement around on our continent. We are then due to move on early next year to emerging biotechnologies, and it was for this reason that I took so many notes over the last day and a half. We started to kind of nibble away at synthetic biology and also nanotechnology, and couldn't quite find the shape of the project that we wanted to work on here. And actually what the Council concluded is that there is something common here about emerging biotechnologies, and we need to know what the anxieties are and where they lie and how we manage them upstream with the public, etc. So it's not specifically about what is the problem with synbio or nano, but could we use some of those examples of synthetic biology as something that's on the verge, nanotech, which is kind of out there but hasn't really been appraised fully, or even going backwards to look at technologies, whether it's about vaccinations or antibiotics, that where we've been through it and taken it forward. So we really wanted to see if there's a way of handling emerging biotechnologies in a broader way. We're on the stocks and waiting to go, and in fact I missed the preparatory workshop that took place yesterday on novel neurotechnologies, where we will look at the potential for interventions in the brain that are arising through current neurotechnologies. We've got a short list of topics that we will go through next spring as potential issues for the future. Genes and parenting, which will which might look at the disconnect between genetic parenting and social parenting that has been, if you like, exacerbated by certain types of fertility treatment, and how important it is to have a genetic connection. Many issues in there. Genome-wide associations, the potential that they give for data mining, for the linking of databases and the implications for privacy. Pandemics, hugely expensive new therapies, and germline therapies, which are, we're kind of, the starting point here is the potential for treating mitochondrial disease by nuclear transfer, and whether that kind of opens up a new question of germline changes. So this is what we may be doing in the relatively near future. But finally, and we may come around to a conversation here, that broadly speaking, we've seen over these 20 years quite a change in the way bioethics has been working, starting from 20 years ago, when people were still kind of fixated on 4 principles of medical bioethics, which were really centered around individual relationships between doctor and patient. And that has broadened out so much now into wider ways, so that we're now talking about intergenerational justice, for example, as some of the important principles that we're working with. And so the way that we put these frameworks together in the context of each specific topic is increasingly interesting, but increasingly complex as well. The globalization of science, medicine, trade, and everything else, and of the issues that we're looking at, is having a huge impact on the way that we work. One of the topics that the Council has been keen to try and break into, but hasn't yet found a route into it, is about global health inequalities. And here we need to have some discussion, and we plan to do that next year, start a discussion with representatives from a number of developing countries from across all continents, about how we can start to approach this in a way that will be fruitful from their point of view, more so than from ours. And so this international agenda, I think, is an important one. It's a growing one, and hopefully it's part of the conversation that we can start to have amongst ourselves, and as certainly Amy knows, is happening amongst groups around the world. We have a European forum of advisory committees. We have a global forum supported by WHO as well, and a number of bilaterals too. So this is a fascinating time to be getting into this. Thank you. That's taken far too long. I apologise for that.
As I said, we got started a little bit late, and I think we're pleased that you got through all that material and took the time to do it in the pace that you did. But I have a suspicion that there are a few questions for you from the group. Yeah, Nelson.
So I was reading some of your materials. I'll admit I did. Earlier this morning, and I noticed that you had some discussion about how you interdigitate with other international bodies, to include not just WHO, but the World Medical Association, UNESCO, and other international bodies, which is something that we, of course, discussed in our own deliberations yesterday, that perhaps we need to expand some of our deliberations on that. So from a practical standpoint, how do you implement that outreach to the global community when you yourself said that the Nuffield model, as an example, might not fit directly if you went across the channel?
Well, I think there are two things to preface this with. One is that's true. I don't think we can simply export our model to anybody else and say, this will work for you. But we can explain how we do it, how we think it works, what elements we think are important, and then people can take advantage of that if it's helpful. Certainly, it's helpful to us to see how other people work. And I've already got, I think there's some interesting discussion to be had about how you have taken your draft proposals out to the public at this stage, that I think we can examine for ourselves whether that would be a fruitful way of working. So I think that we can share those experiences quite helpfully. The second point is that in that international dialogue, I think that there were some thoughts some years ago that it might be possible to get groups of advisory committees together and find a common position or common opinions. I don't think that's realistic, frankly. Not because necessarily we are at such different points philosophically or in terms of where we might arrive at, but also because constitutionally I think some committees have a great difficulty in committing in that way when their relationship with their own governments or departments is of a different nature. So So there were some discussions around that I think were not didn't get very far. So what tends to happen is that we get drawn into sharing information, sharing ideas, understanding different positions, and increasingly as we are tackling issues that are of a global nature in all of their dimensions, it's just increasingly important to hear those perspectives. If we're going to try and make recommendations to WHO about programs that they should implement, let's know what people are thinking about these issues in other parts of the world, so that we're not simply setting up an unrealistic expectation.
Dan.
Thanks. That was terrific, very informative for us, I think, which is wonderful and part of the dialogue I hope we will continue to have. I have two questions. One relating to a question Tom Murray put to us yesterday, and I'll put back to you. And the question is, who do you think your audience is for your reports and work? And then the second, a question of topic. Of all the ones you talked, they were very centered on technology. And I wondered if you ever consider looking at questions related to the ethics of the delivery of healthcare services. The ethics, for instance, of comparative effectiveness, research, controversies around what NICE does, et cetera, which are probably more controversial in the U.S. than in the U.K., but maybe that's helpful.
Yeah. Okay. On the first question, our audience, we've got various audiences, and to some extent one does have to separate them. So we certainly address policymakers, whether it's in government, international organisations, professional bodies, and as has been discussed this morning, it's most helpful if our recommendations are made very specific, very targeted, very, very practical, so that we can initiate conversations that are based on something tangible. We have a responsibility within our terms of reference to promote public discussion and understanding. So we have a public audience. So we have to make sure that our work is accessible and that we use mechanisms for promoting that discussion, whether it's through the media. We have a group that addresses young people in particular. And so we develop, for example, educational materials that we feed out through partner organisations into schools, not to promote our conclusions, but to promote the discussion of the topics. We produce this short version of the report that is much more readable for people who are just on a 20-minute bus ride. We also produce a one-page, A4-page version, which we send to members of Parliament, because we reckon that's about the extent of their attention span. Ordinarily, they're not. Do they listen to this? But it's a very, very important question, and we have to vary our message depending on our audiences, but it bothers us all the time how we're going to achieve this. We can't talk to 60 million people individually. We are too small. We just don't have the resources. We can work with other people to try and promote that through, for example, we work with a touring theatre company who take stuff out on the road. We're talking to other councils. The Danish Council on Ethics does some fabulous work. The French Council on Bioethics has a kind of public day where they have hundreds of people and school kids in for the day. These kind of things other people are doing that we also will try to look at, but on, pretty limited resource.
Oh, right, on the technology.
Oh, sorry.
Yes,
Yeah. It's difficult. We've got. I've given you a kind of short list of the topics that we're thinking about. There's a long list of other things that we could think about. The question about delivery, we struggle with that because we talked a few years ago about whether we should get into the question of allocation of healthcare resources, for example. It's a tough question. Two reasons why that was difficult. First, it was difficult for us to see why we should be able to crack that when nobody else has been able to over the last 30 years. So this was about a unique contribution that we would want to identify that we could bring. But the second is about terms of reference. I mean, our terms of reference are based on examining questions arising from new developments in biomedical sciences. In research in the biomedical sciences. So we need to anchor our work at some point. And the trustees of our funding agencies are quite happy about us, being pretty loose around the boundaries. But I think there is nevertheless an anchor there, which is about developments arising from research in the biosciences.
John, and then Anita, I think you'll have the last question, okay?
So, Hugh, thanks for a really engaging and informative presentation. Thanks very much. And I also want to thank you for all these years of work with the Nuffield Council. I'm a long-time consumer of your product. And
I'm standing on the shoulders of many other people.
And I think it's absolutely first-rate, so thank you. So you mentioned quite correctly that bioethics has been expanding its reach in recent decades. So, indeed, bioethics began with a very narrow focus on doctor-patient relationships, the 4 principles, which I kid my colleague Jim Childress as being the Georgetown mantra of bioethics. So now you're looking at issues of much wider scope, including global health disparities and so forth. So what I'm wondering is whether and to what extent your working groups have been able to develop an alternative ethical framework that can really encompass the sorts of issues that arise in, say, public health or global health frontiers. Do you intend to try to make some headway on that issue in a frontal assault, by trying to, self-consciously develop an alternative way of viewing things, or do you expect that to sort of bubble up from the individual projects that you undertake?
Well, first, I think it's highly unlikely that the Council will wish to or will try to set down an ethical framework that it will, if you like, use in different contexts. I think it's very much, certainly for the time being, committed to the notion that I think is something that Tom Murray says that I think it bears repeating, is that good ethics starts with good facts, and that's where the Council starts, is with examination of the facts, of looking at a situation, identifying then which are the ethical considerations that are in play, and only then set them down within a framework that is applicable there. So I think that the first answer to that question is that it will. I don't think it will look for an ethical framework. And we had a report commissioned we commissioned John Harris and Sarah Chan a few years ago to look at the work that the Council had done over the years in working up these ethical frameworks. And what they identified was that the Council has become more systematic about developing its frameworks, but nevertheless puts up an individual framework for each case. There are some common themes, and this is where I think we move on a little bit. And this is where we do see some common themes. And this question about social solidarity is one that is emerging, I think, as a common factor. And we've certainly seen it in our dementia report, in our medical profiling report. We will see it coming through. We talked about it to some extent in our public health report as well. But we talked about community as... so we're putting the labels on. So some things will emerge, and some things will evolve. I think we'll just let that process take its course.
And finally, Anita.
Hi, thank you. This has been incredibly helpful. The UK is a multinational state, multicultural society. You have people who are immigrants, whose parents or grandparents are immigrants from Africa, South Asia, India, people coming from the European off-island continent. So do you have structures or procedures within your council that enable you to take into account the inevitable diversity of opinion and perspective that must come from being in that kind of a society? And we're also that kind of society. And so I'm very curious about whether you've adopted certain strategies for your work that enable you to take into account these diversities, and how that might also bear on social solidarity as a principle within your framework.
Thank you. You have saved the really toughest question for last. You will have. I mean, you saw the photograph of our council members, and they are of a certain age and ethnicity, and gender-wise, it's kind of a little better than it was, but it's still predominantly male. The council is quite conscious of this, and in fact, so to take several aspects of it, I'll try and be brief. In recruiting new members, the council has a subcommittee that is chaired externally by an independent person who challenges the council on this very point in terms of its social, professional, ethnic and gender mix. And so the council does not want to engage in a kind of tokenistic way of finding quotas, and it's working in an environment where there is already a certain imbalance. So I think all I can say is in terms of the council itself, it worries away at it, but with only modest degrees of success. And the same is true of its working parties. In terms of gathering up views externally during the course of its work, all I can say is that we do what we can. The council is certainly committed to being as transparent, as inclusive as it can be in trying to reach to get people engaged in its work, whether it's through our program of work with young people, whether it's through our public consultations where we go out to the media, we try and reach into community groups, we're struggling with questions about how to find representativeness in the opinions that we take in. So, for example, we've started to have deliberative meetings of members of the public where a kind of representative group, to the extent that we can, will be brought together. But we can't claim that this represents public opinion. That is absolutely not what that can do. So we worry away at that. We do what we can. We make sure that we try and reach as wide a community as we can. But I think that we've got a hell of a battle still to go before we can be satisfied with how far we've actually managed to do that.
Hugh, thank you for your taking the time to be with us for these 2 days. We especially appreciate your presentation today and knowing that we have a new comrade with whom we can communicate in our continuing work. Excuse me. So thank you again.